3D tools. So we did use a camera whenever we looked at the parallax thing last week. But After Effects 3D tools aren't truly 3D. They're more like 2.5D. Primarily because you don't get the benefit of solid volumes like you do with a 3D program like Blender or Cinema or Maya. A solid volume being a sphere or a cube or some other sculpted shape that actually has material in all three dimensions, all right? After Effects will really only ever have material in 2 dimensions, X and Y. We kind of fake we have the Z space to work in, but the items we work with don't have that actual dimension, except in one instance. Now, we can also fake those, which we'll do. When I'm done going through all this, we're going to make a cube, a 3D cube in After Effects, which isn't really a tough thing to do, but it's got some steps. So anyway, it's really 2.5D. And if we're going to work with the 3D tools, I'm just going to create a composition. Let's see, about 10 seconds long is all I need. 1920 by 1080. And we'll do 24 frames a second. All right. So the first thing to know is that we're going to actually look at the 3D functionality as well as camera and light. You don't have to use all of these things together in After Effects. You can use one or the other in some cases, or you can use them all three together. So I'm going to begin by adding just a solid to my composition because I want a background with some color in it. So I'm going to add a solid, and by itself this is just a 2-dimensional shape, all right? And I'm just going to type, I'm just going to use some type, actually, no. I'm going to grab my rounded, or my ellipse tool, actually, and go down here, and I'm going to draw a circle here, and then I'm going to duplicate it. So I got the circle. I want to center my anchor point, or my center point to it. So transform, center my anchor point to my layer content, and this is circle 1. Then I'm just going to duplicate that, circle 2 and circle 3, and position them kind of like this. Actually, on this middle one, I'm going to slide down a little bit. We'll do that. That. And that. All right. 3 objects within this scene, within this composition. And they're all still 2-dimensional objects. So if we want to turn these into 3-dimensional objects, all we really need to do is go down here to our timeline, and with the switches up, this set of icons right here, the very last one in the list here is a little cube. We simply turn on all of those, and those become 3D objects. And the way I know is if I select one of them, I get this little 3D widget that's assigned to it. And each one has its own. So my viewport is basically my camera view. And this is where the objects are inside of it. And as a 3D object, we can rotate these any number of ways we want. Left and right, up and down. It's a circle, so it doesn't really show much going that way, but basically, you know, we've got controls in all three dimensions, our X dimension and our Y dimension, which is what we're used to working with. We really haven't, that's all we've had so far. By turning these into 3D layers, we add this Z dimension, this Z dimension. And if we take a look at if we go down here to the bottom and take a look at our transforms, you'll see that for our rotation, we've got three dimensions here, an X, a Y, and a Z. And with our scale, there's an X, a Y, and a Z. So we've now got this third dimension to work with. The other thing that happens anytime that we turn an object in our composition into a 3D object, we get some additional tools up here along the top. So if you'll notice, I now have three tools here that I never had before. The first one's an orbit, second one's pan, and the third one is a dolly towards the cursor. So if I grab the orbit tool and click, I now can sort of rotate around these objects. Basically, I'm changing where this is a virtual camera because we haven't actually added a camera to this scene at all, but kind of changing the viewpoint of my virtual camera with that orbit. And if I use the pan right next to it, actually I don't need to have anything selected. So if I use pan, that just kind of moves me left and right, up and down around my view space. And the dolly allows me to zoom in and zoom out on those objects in the Z space. So really, creating a 3D space to work in is as simple as, for the objects that you have on your screen or in your project window, activating that 3D switch. It's as simple as that. You can actually, if you notice, I did not activate the 3D switch on my solid background because I didn't want to. I can have 3D objects and 2D objects in the same space. It doesn't have to be one or the other, all right? This is kind of nice because if I just want a blue background color in my entire scene, that's what that does. And it doesn't matter where I pan to or dolly, that blue space is always there. Now, if I would happen, though, to go ahead and take this solid and actually make it a 3D object, now it's in the space somewhere. And now I've got to worry about positioning it. So, I can still pan around, but now that solid is part of my 3D objects and goes with it. We do have the ability to set lights, which we'll look at briefly, which cast shadows. 3D lights will cast shadows with any 3D object. But if they will not cast shadows, though, on a 2D object. So, And again, I'm just kind of looking at through this virtual camera right at the moment. And if I'm going to actually turn that solid back to a shape. If I open up that solid and I look at my position transforms, the third one is my Z-space. If I move that back, remember we're looking through a camera. So what happens if anytime we're looking through a lens of anything, the further away things get from us, the smaller they get, right? Same thing happens here. But we can, you can always scale those objects up to fill our space. So, and as we're looking at it here, it doesn't look like we've done a whole lot, but we've done more than you think. So, that's kind of the basics of 3D objects and 3D spaces. And we can animate all of these that way. So, let's also take a look at the change that's happened to our composition area. So, we've now got some drop downs down here that we didn't have before. We've got Draft 3D, here's Classic 3D, Active Camera, and View. So, just like a 3D application of any kind, I'm going to slide that way over out of the way so I got plenty of room to work here. Let's do that and do that. All right. So I'm going to start with this right-hand drop-down where it says One View. If I click on that, I've got options now for 2 to 4 views. So if I select 4 views, what I'm looking at here, and I can see within each of these windows, this is a top view, because it's labeled top. This is a front view, which looks a lot like our camera view, but you'll see in a minute it's not really the same thing. And here's a right view. If I select any of these workspaces, like say I select this front view workspace, or actually I'm going to select the right view workspace here. The second drop down, it's, this is labeled right, and if I select that one, that area, I can see that that's the right view. I can change the view there. So maybe I want that to actually be my left view, which in this case doesn't look any different, but I can change my views that way. Back view. Back view makes sense because I moved this blue shape back in the Z space. So looking at it from behind, I can't see my red dots here, which if we take a look at our top view, if I select my blue solid here, this is where it actually lives in that Z space, all the way back here. My circles, on the other hand, all live up here. And we can move those around. I find 4 views in After Effects personally kind of clunky to work with and to look at. I don't like it. I work with 3D, I work with 4 views all the time in Cinema and Blender, but in After Effects, there's just too much going on, I think, personally. Which is why most of the time when I work with the 3D tools, I'm actually working with 2 views. I'm working with my active camera, and usually I'm working with my top view. So like this right now is a left view. I'll switch that to top. And this is usually what I work with. So that it just gives me more to look at. It's not as confusing and not as cluttery. I don't know how, 4 views should be as easy to look at in one program as it is another, but After Effects just seems clunky. So I was working, in the 2 views. So we've got multiple views. It is important to point out, and I never really realized, I never bothered me at all, but lately I've had this question asked a couple of times. So I'm looking at the top view here, and this area is my same 1920 by 1080 composition, shape that I've got in my camera. But I'm not constrained to this space in the top view whatsoever. I mean, here's my solid all the way back here, and I see it just fine within my camera view. You can use as much space as you need to use. You're not constrained by this frame area on your top left and right views. I mean, if it's easier to deal with, change, maybe instead of looking at it as a transparent view, I'll just look at it as black. But don't feel like you have to stay inside of that area when you're working, all right? So and it's just, when I work in this top view, if I pull this solid towards me, it's getting closer and closer. There's my 3 dots, my 3 circles. And if I pull it past them, now the blue solid's in front of those, and I can't see them anymore. So you always just kind of keep track of where your shapes are within your 3D space. All right? Any questions so far? Anything I need to recover? It's just kind of getting used to the difference in the space and realizing I've now got this third dimension to work in. So far, it's not all that complicated, I don't think. And it's not overall, actually, but anyway. So let's look at these circles now. So in my top view, I'm just going to push this one back. I'm going to pull this one forward. And this one I'll push back a little bit. This one again, I want to grab and shove him back further. So the further they get away from my virtual camera, the smaller they get. The closer they get, the bigger they get. So kind of keep that in mind as you work with those a little bit. So continuing across these, to finish out these drop downs here at the bottom. Classic 3D or advanced 3D will pretty much be the two we work with. It is worth noting that Adobe and Maxon, which makes Cinema 4D, the full-fledged 3D app, actually have an agreement. And I know that Blender's free and everything, but if you ever have the inkling that you'd like to learn more about 3D animation and that kind of thing, I learned on Cinema 4D. That's what I use. It's got a monthly fee. I just do the monthly license thing. I use it and I renew it, or I drop it if I don't need it. But Blender, on the other hand, is free. So I get the idea, I get the desire to work with, look at Blender. But Maxon and Adobe actually have an agreement where Adobe's or Maxon's raw 3D tools are actually kind of worked into After Effects a little bit, as well as one of its renderers, and I forget which one. And that's why we've got under this, where we're looking at where we'll work with Classic 3D most of the time. There is a Cinema 4D option down here, and if I enable that, which I'll go ahead and do, but it takes a little bit because it's got to load up the tools for it. It doesn't keep them loaded by default. If I use the Cinema 4D mode, I actually get the ability to extrude objects and give them volume. I can't do a sphere, and I can't do lathed objects and swept objects and that kind of thing. But I can do extruded objects. Um, and there we go. Now it's loaded up. I could select that, and I could, when I go underneath the circle shape in my timeline, there's a geometry options category here now, and that's is only here when I'm using the Cinema 4D option, but I can extrude that shape. Actually, I'll extrude it a lot. And now if I rotate this, you'll see that it has some depth to it. That's the closest you get to real 3D in After Effects. It comes with a price in terms of render speed and screen preview speed. It's memory intensive. If you've gotten into things with After Effects that you thought were memory intensive before, that's the real deal. So it is there. You can look at it if you like, but especially when you start combining it with lights and it starts casting shadows, trying to cast shadows over that volume, it's a lot of work for it to do. Especially on, I think, 8 gigs of RAM or whatever most of these machines have, I think. So, I mean, I've got 16 on my laptop and it still can struggle, so I just don't. But there is kind of a pipeline between the true Cinema 4D program and After Effects that you can set up so that if you've got a 3D scene in Cinema, you can actually bring it in and work with it in After Effects to a degree. So, just to know, we're not going to get into that, but just to know that option's there if it's ever necessary. So, having done all of that, I am going to switch back out of that mode and just go back to classic. All right. So, yep, and there went my extrude. All right. So that's all of our space. All right. So let's take a look at what other changes are there in these shapes. All right, so there's some other, by turning on this 3D mode, aside from the changes in our transform by adding that third dimension in, we've also got material options which come into play when we use 3D lights. This basically can help us affect the color of the object when lights are present. So keep in mind that that's there. All right, so we've got those shapes. Let's look at a camera. So within my scene here, I'm going to go up to my layer menu, new, and I'm going to add a camera to my scene now. And it brings up this window. There's a lot of settings in here. If you know anything about video cameras, some of this will make sense to you. If you don't, it's okay. Things to know, the only things you really have to know are that on the presets, so on the lenses, 35 millimeters is kind of a default camera lens. The smaller the lens gets, obviously the wider the angle, the view angle. The larger the lens size gets, there's more telephoto. So this is a normal size, this would be extreme wide angle, and this would be telephoto, 200 millimeter telephoto. I'm going to leave it at 30, actually I'm going to change it to 24, just because you'll see the difference in our viewport whenever I do. The rest of it we're just going to leave alone. But some things to point out, we are going to look at depth of field with this. What's nice about working with a camera is depth of field, blurring, space, objects in space. Aperture, by default, is usually around 4 to 7. Aperture is going to be have one of the bigger impacts on the amount of blur you get with depth of field. So we're not going to worry about setting them here, but I just want to point those two out. So we've got all these camera settings. I could just create the camera settings from my current view. So whatever this is, if I check this box, that's what it'll pick up. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to set it 24 millimeters, say OK. So there's the way so now my active camera view is being driven by camera 1 in my animation window. And I should have pointed out too. If I double click on the camera itself, it'll bring that dialog box back up. I'm using a 2-node camera. There are 2 different types of cameras, 2-node and 1-node. The difference being that a 1-node camera is strictly the camera itself. So if I switch to a 1-node camera, say OK, open up my camera options, and I'll look at the transform. A 1-node camera is simply my camera, nothing else. All right? So I'll control it. My camera's back here. This is my view cone. So basically, see the view cone goes edge to edge right at the middle, and that's what I'm seeing over here. If I were to extend this out, you'd see that it actually bypasses this the shape I've got in the background, which is why I get my gap there. So I can scale my background shape up to fill that if I want. But there's my camera. This is the view cone. If I want a 2-node camera, what a 2-node camera is going to do, and really I control this camera just by moving it around. I can rotate it any number of ways, but it just affects the camera and moves the view cone overall. If I switch this back to like from top to front, you'll see that if I tilt it up or down, it's all working 3-dimensionally. So I'm going to double click on this camera again real quick. I'm using 1-node. If I want to use a 2-node camera, it's going to add to it. I got to go back to the top view to see this easily. If I select my camera, you'll see that I didn't have this little anchor point before, and now I do. This isn't actually an anchor point. It's referred to as a point of interest, and you'll see that that's now reflected in our camera options. The thing about a point of interest is, if I grab that point of interest and move it, it affects my camera. The camera is always going to be trained on that point. Which is kind of nice to know because I can always train that point of interest on like a null that travels along a path and have this camera follow that along. So, move it left to right, it gives me kind of a pan effect. Move it up and down, it'll give me a tilt effect, that kind of thing. Something though that is kind of important to know about that point is, if I move my camera towards, if I grab my camera, it's actually parented to that camera, it's going to travel with it. But if I work with the position controls over here, and let's say I move my position of my camera itself, see that now that point of interest is no longer moving with it. If I move it this way and I get too close to it, it flips it because it always wants to be trained on that point of interest. So it's always going to follow it. This is why I usually just start out with 3D camera and as a single node camera, so you don't have to deal with that. Because as you start working and you're not paying attention, eventually something's going to flip on you and you can't figure out why, and that's usually the reason. So, and I know that probably means nothing at this stage, but it will eventually. So I'm going to actually switch this back to a one-node camera. Just keep life simple. So our camera, we can fly through this scene. We've got, our first circle's here. If I push this camera through, it kind of flies right through everything, which is kind of cool. And so what about that depth of field I was talking about? So I'm going to close my transforms and open up my camera options. And there are a whole bunch of different options here under camera, but our depth of field is on. This focal distance right now is right here. And if I move this focal distance line, you'll see that I extend that out. This becomes sort of a focal range. And remember I said the aperture is the single item that affects our depth of field the most. I'm going to crank this aperture from 12 way up. And look what's happening in my active camera window. Objects that are closer to the camera are starting to get blurry. Objects that are further away from the camera are starting to get blurry. But anything that's right near that focal plane is nice and sharp. So I've introduced depth of field into the mix. And we can also adjust the blur level, cranking that way up, or down. It's set to 100% now, but we can use that aperture and blur level to kind of fine-tune what we get. And as my camera travels through this scene, so right now this focal plane is right on this circle. If I push this through, as I get closer to the circle in the back, it gets sharper, so my focus changes. If I pull it back, I get that. Let's see. And you can get some different effects there, I think, on the blur too. If we start looking at if we start looking at our iris shape on the camera, it's going to change the way that blur looks as well. And we can change the iris rotation, which doesn't appear to do a whole lot, but so I'm going to leave that as a fast rectangle and let it do what it does. But those controls, kind of control all that. So my blue shape back here, again, I probably don't actually want that to be a 3D object, so I'm just going to turn that off so that it fills the scene. And now wherever my camera is, it's never going to pass through that blue shape. If it's a 2D object, it's always just going to kind of live back there out of reach. But to give a scene, a color background of some kind, that's a good way to do it. Any questions so far? Yeah, I mean, full control over the 3D camera, which is really kind of nice. There. All right. So that's the camera. So let's toss lights into this mix, the last item. So I am going to go ahead and add another object to my scene here. I'm going to create a rectangle. And make sure nothing's selected. Let's make this that color. Make sure I turn it into a 3D object. And then I'm just going to grab it and move it back just behind this middle circle here, because I'm going to kind of zoom in on that. So I'm actually, so these orbit, pan, and zoom tool, dolly tools, will affect the position of my camera if I use those. So I'm just going to kind of dolly into that. A little bit. And then, what's the best way to do this to make sure it makes sense? And then if I go into my layer panel again, new, there's a light option. And by default, the intensity is usually 60%. I think the last time I used it, I cranked it up. And it's usually got a warmer color to it, something like that. I'm just going to use so there's different light types. A spotlight is what you'd expect. It's basically, imagine a spotlight that's trained on a focal point. A point light is just like a light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Parallel and ambient is just that general light level that a room will have with or without lights. So I'm just going to make a point light. Say okay. So you see now that I've done that, it's kind of changing my scene up a little bit as well. And if I move this closer to that blue wall, you'll see that it's kind of lighting it a little bit. And if I pull it over here, here's that red circle I've got. If I grab this light and kind of pull it to the side here and then up, what I want to do is cast a shadow. So I can select this object, and if I open it up, remember I said there's some material options in here. I want this item to cast shadows. Oop, see, they start dropping a shadow right on that plane. Accept shadows, yes. Light transmission. It's kind of how much the light affects it. Mostly in the shadow areas. And then we can adjust, there's some different things for that object, for the color. If I adjust the shininess, it's actually going to make it a little bit darker. Specular intensity will make it brighter where that light hits it. So if I zoom in here, you can kind of see that highlight hitting the edge of it. I'm going to change my top view to a front view and slide my light source up. And if I double click on that point light, I'll get that dialog box again. And I'm going to increase the radius of the light. Fall off is the amount of how the light falls off over distance. But I'm just going to crank up the fall off distance. It didn't have a huge effect. So we can set up, you know, shadows and that kind of thing with objects. Again, this is one of those things, lights and shadows come with the expense of slower rendering speeds as well as display rendering being slower. So I work with those sparingly for the most part, I think. But just so you can see them and see what all they do. Any questions so far? You still good? All right. So a practical application for some of this, especially the depth of field and the objects. So you remember that remember whenever we looked at looping of objects, we also looked at parallax. What I did with you guys was sort of a very simple form of parallax. It wasn't a full-blown version of it. But let's see. Actually, let's do this. Let's create save that. All right, and now I'm going to open up .3D cameras and the depth of field become extremely useful with fairly true parallax. Where we actually, you know, add depth of field to our camera and that kind of thing. And I'm just using it in this example was just as a pan across, because that's all I wanted to do. But you can see that by spacing these out fairly extreme, we get the benefit of that camera and the fact that that view cone spreads out so much, so that as this does pace across, you notice how the object in the front seems to move independently of the other objects. When we did parallax the other day, we simply set a 3D camera, but then we didn't mess with the depth of field or anything. We just positioned a couple of, you know, we sort of pushed items back in space a little. But this one's much more of a fully set up parallax kind of a movement. I didn't use lights with it, but it does use depth of field and the camera and all the other good stuff. And I actually, if you watch this work as this goes across, my trees are in focus here, and I just kind of keyframe that focal plane that we looked at on the camera. They're in focus there, and as we get closer to the bird, the trees fall out of focus, but the bird falls into focus. And as we leave the bird, the trees focus again, and then we focus in on this guy. So by adjusting that focal plane, we can control things like that, which, you know, gives a simple, I mean, a flat photo, a nice dimensional kind of a look. So all sorts of things you can kind of do with the 3D tools. You know, we looked at type animation. Uh, and while that's using a 3D, using the camera, this is more about um, a type animator used with 3D type. So you can, the type animators we looked at last class, you can use as a 3D object as well. Time we got. Oof. And that's got some other stuff thrown into it, but so that's, you know, kind of working with 3D objects. You know, the thing about, you know, while we can't really create volume per se, I think I have. Let's look here. Looking for something specific. I don't save. Okay. Oh, that's not what I wanted. This combines type with lights and a 3D camera. Little shadows. I have here somewhere. Saffron, fall, ocean. Oh, here. Even though we, you know, can't create real volumes, we can kind of fake it. September 12th. And let's see what this one does. And do things like that. Which is really just being slow. Come on. Okay. So here's that animation I just showed you. But it's really just, you know, a camera setup with a book kind of faked. I mean, it's just 3 different planes, but it all happens so fast. I mean, you know, motion graphics are really kind of optical illusions to a degree anyway, kind of faking it. So even though there's no depth to the cover, the speed of the movement, the light and everything else kind of disguises that fact that it doesn't have any real depth. But and creating shapes and things like that aren't as difficult as you might think they are. So let's do real quick, just to, hopefully this doesn't take very long. Let's create a new composition, and I want to do a couple of things. New composition or new project, whichever one you want. Yeah, let's see if that's, I'll have to wait on it next time. All right. So let's create and we'll do that little book thing. There's a cube exercise that's kind of cool, but the book won't take as long, I don't think, and it'll still get the same point across, I think. So let's create a composition. And then I'm going to create how many compositions? Yeah, we'll keep this one simple. We're just going to create 3 other compositions. So I'm going to create a composition that is let's create a composition that's 1080. So let's see. Let's do 500 wide by 900 tall. I didn't make this. Oh, make sure you've got your lock aspect ratio turned off. So I want 500 width, 900 height, which makes us, let's open that up and let's make it actually, instead of 500, let's make it 700 wide by 900 tall. There we go. So we get a composition like that. It's kind of like roughly the size of a book cover. All right. So we did that, and I want you to put a solid inside of that composition. And I also want you to name this front cover. And I'll tell you why we're doing this in compositions in a minute instead of just making shapes. So call that first 700 by 900 one front cover, and place a solid in it of any color that you want. Mine's going to be light blue. And then we're going to take that, we're going to duplicate it. So if you just select the composition and do Command D, call the duplicated one back cover. And then we're going to make a third composition. That is, we're going to keep the 900 tall, but we're going to make the width 300 wide. So that gives us that. And again, put a solid inside of that too. It can be the same colors you had before. Doesn't really matter. Oops. And make sure you name that spine. So we have a back cover, a front cover, and a spine. And this first comp we made that was 1920 by 1080, let's just call that our scene or something. Something so you know what it is. All right? So if we open our scene, we're going to take our front cover, our back cover, and our spine, and we're going to drag them right down in here. It should place them right about like that. And then we're going to do this. So let's think about this. So what I'm going to create is, I'm actually going to recreate that book cover that I just did. So it's got a front cover, it's got a back cover, it's got a spine, all right? So if I'm going to lay this out flat, you know, take any book, lay it out flat. Basically my front cover is going to be, and I'm looking at the inside of it, my front cover will be to the left-hand side of the spine. My back cover will be to the right-hand side of the spine, right? So let's just grab our back cover. We're going to slide it, and we're going to grab our front cover, and we're going to slide it as well. We're going to kind of pull these in kind of close to the spine. And because we're going to animate this, we got to think about how it's going to animate. So if it's going to start wide open, because that's the way we're going to start it, it's going to fold right on all of these seams, right? Where all these objects come together. So what I want to set up here is, I'm going to grab the back cover. If I turn on snapping and grab my anchor point tool, I'm going to drag my center point right over here to the edge of my back cover. I'm going to grab the, let's see here, wait a minute. Is that what I want to do? I got to think this through again for a minute. I've done this a dozen times, and I still got to think it through every time. No, because actually whenever I animate it, the back cover is going to stay stationary. So actually the spine and the front cover are going to be the ones that fold. So I'm going to leave the center point in the middle on the back cover, but on the spine, I want to move the center point right here onto the right edge, because that's the point that it's going to fold on. And my front cover, I'm going to move it to the right edge, because again, that's where it's going to fold on. And then I'm just going to grab my selection tool and pull my back cover over until it's just touching the spine. I'm going to do the same thing with my front cover until it's just touching the spine, barely. If you've got a little gap, that's probably okay. It probably doesn't really matter actually that much. But, and if it helps you at all to see the difference in everything, go into your spine and change the color of the background on the spine, if nothing else, which I'm going to do actually. Oops. Cancel. Got my, that. Layer. Solid settings. I'm just going to make it a little darker. That way I can see my spine. I just want to be able to see all my parts. So now I want to parent these all together. Actually, let's turn them all into 3D objects at this point. So select all three of these objects and just turn them into 3D objects. And then the spine is going to fold, is going to be, then I need to parent my objects together. So my spine, I'm going to parent to the back cover. And my front cover, I'm going to actually parent to the spine. So basically when the spine moves, I want the back cover to move too. And then when the front cover moves, it's going to move on its own, basically. All right? So we've done that. If I grab the back cover here, you see it all moves around together. And now I'm just going to make a couple of quick adjustments. So I'm going to leave it flat. Let's open our spine and our front cover up. Let's grab those, and we're going to change rotations on these. So I think it's, let's see, which one do I need to move? Yeah. So I'm going to actually start with this edge of the spine, and I'm going to set a keyframe for, what did I need to move? All right. Whenever I use my widget and start to fold this, it's my orientation that changes. So I'm just going to set my orientation on both of those on keyframe 1 to be flat. And then I'm going to come out here to 2 seconds, and I'm going to grab this widget for my spine, and I'm going to fold this up 90 degrees or so. 89, 90. And then I'm going to grab the front cover only. And I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees as well. If I dolly back, you'll see that, actually I'll dolly back, I'm actually going to grab my orbit tool. See? We kind of made, do I need to do that again for anybody? Did I lose anybody on why I did what I did? Yeah? Okay. So I'm just kind of thinking about how things kind of go together, you know? So did you get this far? So how far back? The beginning? Do you have the compositions made? Oh, I can't go back that far, but I'll circle back around to you. How far back? Okay, so you've basically you're where I am right here. No? You're, what's that? Okay, so did you place your center points to the edges? You did that. And then did you parent these together? Okay, so you've got these all. So you just need, and do you have them moved into position like this? Okay, so the back is what's going to, if we're going to move our entire book, the back is what's going to kind of drive that. So what we're going to do is actually parent the spine. So if we come down here to our, and I'll just undo this and do it again. So I'm going to come here to the spine, and I want to parent the spine to the back cover. So anywhere the back cover goes, the spine goes with it. So select the spine, and you can either use, either change none to back cover, or you can use that little pick whip, which is what I did. And then the cover itself always needs to follow the spine. So we're going to parent the front cover to the spine. So that's kind of our chain. All right. So then once we've done all that, these are all 3D objects, right? Then I'm going to start with the spine. And I just kind of I'm going to start with this thing opened up, and I'm just going to close it to animate it. So I'm going to select my spine and my front cover, and it's going to be rotations on those, I think. And I'm just going to start with the spine itself. If I deselect those, grab my spine, and I'm just going to use this widget, the little green dot on it, that little green dot. Just click on it and move it until I'm at minus 90 degrees. And if everything's parented together, that cover should go with it. And then I'm going to do, oops, I messed up. I set my keyframes, but I didn't come out here to 2 seconds. Okay, so this is where I want. There we go, 90. And then we're just going to select only the front cover, and we're going to do the same thing there again. We're going to rotate it. Oops. Rotate it, minus 90. You good? Got kind of a box. If you use your orbit tool, you can kind of see what you've got. So here's a fun thing then. If we move our timeline, our book closes. So the reason I did this with compositions instead of just, I could have done this with just shapes, easy enough. But I did it with compositions because now, theoretically, I can go back into each composition and I can do anything I want within that composition and it'll get applied to the book. So I can give it a title, I can change the color of the cover, make it brown leather. I could get a photo of leather, bring it in, place it in that composition, and now my book has a leather cover, you know? So that's why I do the composition thing. It's more flexible. The only thing that might screw up on this is that I didn't pay attention to was the face orientation. I might have this backwards. I'm not 100% sure. But I won't, actually, I guess the easy way to tell is to do this. If I open my front cover and I type book, and now I come back to my scene, it's backwards. But because when you're working with 3D, even though they're flat, basically no Z dimension, there's still a front and back. So, and if I was actually creating a real book, I would actually probably create a composite, and I'd actually put type or numbers or something on it so that I can tell if I got my orientation right. But I would probably actually create a front, for my front cover, for the front cover, I'd do a cover front and a cover back so that I've got, whenever it opens up, I could have something else on the inside of the front cover. Different composition, and just put them really close together so that, you know, you can't really see. There's some of the tricks you kind of need to play. Now I can fix this up by simply, I can go back into my front cover and probably the easiest thing to do is break my scale and flip it. Now it reads right. But, you know, and the way it works is that, you know, basically by setting my center points on each of those fold areas, that controls and makes sure that everything rotates where it's supposed to. And then parenting them together makes sure that the front cover always follows the spine. And I can grab the back cover and move it around, do whatever I want to. I could place let's see, I could place a solid or, yes, do a solid. See what we get. I could do a solid that's real light blue. Make it 3D. That kind of becomes my tabletop. Just got to slide them down a little bit. Orbit around that. Oops. Scale that solid way up. I could drop a camera in here and a light source to light it, cast some shadows if I want, you know, pretty much anything. So, I'm actually going to save that. In case you haven't been able to tell, I'm trying to get myself organized. I've got like demos and examples of stuff all over the frickin' place on my laptop and on my hard drive, and I'm trying to organize myself, which is a bigger chore than it ought to be. Anyway, so, you know, so we made a very simple 3D book there. You know, you can do it. I mean, I think Tony Samanji actually does a cube. He actually unfolds it, you know, all 6 sides of a cube and animates it folding together, which is kind of a cool thing. This is just a simpler variation on that that doesn't take quite as long. But the process is exactly the same. I mean, there isn't anything I did here that you don't do there. So, a cube would probably take us another 20, 30 minutes, and I still want to give you the balance of the class to work on your project and kind of see where you're at. So, I want to stop that there. We may come back, we may revisit this a little bit at some point, but just to sort of do maybe a little more, you know, complex scene of some kind. But lots of uses for 3D camera, lots of uses for 3D, you know, features. I mean, I've done this book for projects before. It works out, this, you know, this kind of thing works out really pretty nice. So if you really want to dig into doing a book in After Effects, a 3D looking book, Google book tutorial on YouTube, and there's a guy that actually fills it with pages that all, as the cover opens, the pages all like fold. I mean, it's like, it's cool. It's an extremely heavy file though. It's like huge. So, and he gives a download file. So it's worth taking a look at. I didn't go through the, you know, I just opened up the front and back cover. I didn't put anything inside it. So, but you can even, you know, you can fake those kinds of things too. So, all right. So, what for the balance of class? Go ahead and work on your assignment.